Sit back, relax, and welcome to Reading Hours. Today's book is And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. Please let us know in the comments from where you are watching, or if there is a book you want us to summarize in future. And Then There Were None, first published in 1939, remains one of the most renowned works of mystery fiction in history. Written by the legendary Agatha Christie, who is often hailed as the Queen of Crime, this novel stands out as her magnum opus, and it has earned the distinction of being the best-selling mystery novel ever written. Christie's intricate plotting, her understanding of human psychology, and her ability to create atmosphere have made her a household name. And with And Then There Were None, she took her craft to a new level. The novel is a masterclass in suspense, and it remains a timeless piece of literature that continues to captivate readers and audiences worldwide. Originally published under the title 10 Little Niggers, the book's name was later changed to And Then There Were None, reflecting modern sensibilities and avoiding offensive language. While the title was altered, the novel's essence remained unchanged, and it is the title, And Then There Were None, that has endured in popular culture. This change in title also reflects the evolving attitudes surrounding issues of race, ethics, and social justice, all of which play a role in the novel's thematic exploration. The plot is deceptively simple at first glance. 10 strangers, each invited to a luxurious yet isolated island for different personal reasons, arrive expecting a vacation, a job, or a getaway. But soon, they realize that their host is nowhere to be found, and a sinister force is at play. One by one, the guests begin to die under mysterious circumstances, their deaths eerily reminiscent of a nursery rhyme. 10 little soldiers. The island, which was meant to be a paradise, turns into a prison where every movement, every interaction, and every piece of information seems to point toward a deeper, darker conspiracy. What makes And Then There Were None unique is how it delves into the psychological unraveling of its characters. Each guest has a past, and as their lives unfold, so do their secrets. The mystery is not just about finding out who the murderer is, but about understanding the moral complexities of each character's life and their culpability in the crimes they've committed. Christie brilliantly intertwines guilt, justice, and human fallibility, creating a tense and taut atmosphere that constantly keeps the reader guessing. The novel explores profound themes of morality, justice, and retribution. Each character is not merely a victim or a suspect. They are representations of the many facets of human nature. Their backstories, filled with personal failures, betrayals, and moral compromises, reveal that they are not just innocents caught in a tragic series of events, but rather people whose actions have had consequences. The story forces readers to confront the notion of justice in its most absolute and terrifying form. In a world where the rule of law is absent, who determines right and wrong? And what does true justice look like when there is no one left to answer for the crimes? Another key theme that runs throughout the novel is the idea of fate. As the characters are picked off one by one, the sense of inevitability builds. Each death feels like a step closer to a final, inescapable conclusion, creating a palpable sense of dread and tension that permeates every page. The sense of being trapped, both physically on the island and psychologically by their own guilt, creates a unique atmosphere, unlike any other mystery novel. The characters are not just running from a murderer, they are running from their own conscience, unable to escape the shadow of their past actions. And then, There Were None has left an indelible mark on the mystery genre, influencing countless works of crime fiction, both in print and on screen. It has been adapted into numerous films, television series, radio plays, and stage productions, each bringing a new interpretation to the story while retaining its original core of suspense and intrigue. The novel's impact is far-reaching, from inspiring new generations of writers to becoming a foundational text for mystery fans worldwide. Yet, despite its age, it has lost none of its power to captivate and shock audiences. The novel also stands out for its haunting and iconic conclusion, which has sparked debate and discussion for decades. The eerie rhyme and the chilling final resolution continue to resonate with readers, reinforcing the book's status as one of the most unpredictable and thought-provoking works of fiction in the genre. With And Then There Were None, Christie took the genre of the murder mystery to new heights, blending intricate plotting, moral dilemmas, and psychological depth. It is a story that lingers long after the final page is turned, leaving readers with questions about the nature of justice, the complexity of human nature, and the inescapability of fate. Now, let's dive into the story that has captivated readers for over 80 years and explore the chilling mystery that unfolds on that isolated island, where one by one, all will meet their end. As the boat cut through the cool, silent waters toward the small, isolated island, the passengers on board remained absorbed in their own thoughts, oblivious to the sinister events that would soon unfold. The journey to the island was meant to be the start of a holiday, an escape from their everyday lives. Yet, as they came closer to their destination, an eerie tension seemed to hang in the air, almost as though the island itself was watching them, waiting for something to happen. 10 strangers had been invited to the island under various pretexts. Some had received letters from old acquaintances, while others were summoned for business or personal reasons. None of them had ever met before, and yet they were all bound by a singular event, the invitation to Soldier Island. Despite the beautiful setting and luxurious surroundings promised in the invitation, a strange unease settled over them as they gazed out at the rocky shore. The island was remote, sitting alone in the vast expanse of the ocean, far from the bustling mainland. From a distance, it appeared serene, a picture of natural beauty. But as the boat neared the shore, the sense of isolation became palpable. The guests were greeted by a housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Rogers, and the caretaker of the island, a man by the name of Thomas Rogers. They were both familiar with the island and its hidden corners, but as the guests made their way up to the mansion, the thought that something was off lingered in the back of their minds. Once inside the grand house, the guests were given their rooms and left to settle in. The interior was lavish, with fine furniture and the scent of fresh flowers filling the air. Yet, there was an oppressive quality to the atmosphere that none could shake. The walls seemed to close in, and the absence of any clear connection to the outside world made the guests feel as though they had stepped into a place out of time. There were no servants except for the Rogers couple, and the island seemed to exist in a strange vacuum, disconnected from reality. As the evening drew near, the guests gathered for dinner, still unsure of why they had been invited to this remote corner of the world. It was during this meal that the first real sign of mystery began to reveal itself. The meal was lavish, served with elegance and precision, but there was a peculiar chill in the air. The conversation, as expected, was polite and formal, with the guests exchanging pleasantries, though there was an undercurrent of curiosity. Who were the people who had invited them here? And why had they been brought to this seemingly desolate place? It was when dinner had finished and the group had begun to retire to their respective rooms that the strange event took place. In the sitting room, a gramophone began playing a hauntingly familiar tune, the eerie notes of 10 little soldiers drifting through the air, seemingly coming from nowhere. The song, a children's nursery rhyme, was familiar to all the guests, but it was also unsettling. The lyrics, which told the story of 10 little soldiers who met untimely deaths, echoed through the room, giving the entire situation a surreal quality. At that moment, the mystery of the island deepened. It was clear that someone, perhaps the elusive host, or someone with power over the island, was orchestrating the entire experience. The guests were left to wonder, why were they here? And what was the purpose of this haunting tune? But they were too polite, too curious, or perhaps too uneasy to ask direct questions. Instead, they nodded awkwardly and filed off to their rooms, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had settled over them like a fog. As they retired for the night, the guests could not have known that this was merely the beginning of a terrifying sequence of events. One by one, the strangers would find themselves entangled in a web of fear, suspicion, and uncertainty. The remote island, once an idyllic getaway, would soon become a nightmarish trap, and the shadows that loomed over the mansion would begin to take form. That night, as the guests lay in their beds, unable to sleep, they were unaware of the dark secrets that each of them carried. They had been chosen for a reason, though none of them could have imagined the deadly purpose that awaited them. The island, with its silent waves and unfeeling cliffs, would become the stage for a chilling drama of murder, deception, and retribution. Every breath, every creak of the house, and every glance exchanged between the strangers carried the weight of what was to come. And as the night stretched on, the air grew colder, heavier with the promise of death. But for now, the guests remained unaware of their fate, drifting into uneasy slumbers. Each was left to ponder their mysterious invitation to the island, none yet realizing that they were connected by a shared history, one that would soon come back to haunt them all. As the island settled into darkness, its secrets lay dormant, waiting for the right moment to strike. The shock of Mrs. Rogers' sudden death cast a heavy shadow over the group. At first, the guests were unsure of what to make of it. Was it an accident or something more sinister? The strange events of the previous evening, the haunting nursery rhyme, the cryptic atmosphere of the island had already left them on edge. But now, with the death of one of their own, the terrifying reality of their situation began to sink in. As they gathered in the sitting room after Mrs. Rogers' collapse, the guests exchanged uneasy glances, their minds racing with questions. Thomas Rogers, the butler, appeared shaken, his face pale, though he tried to maintain his composure. He explained that his wife had been unwell for some time, though he couldn't pinpoint the exact cause. Some of the guests seemed to accept this explanation, but others, particularly those who had noticed her nervous behavior earlier, began to suspect something more was at play. The group's concern only deepened when it became apparent that Mrs. Rogers' death was not the result of any obvious injury or physical trauma. There There were no signs of poison, no wounds or marks on her body, nothing that could provide an immediate clue as to how she had died. The only explanation that seemed plausible to them was that she had somehow died of shock. But this, too, was unsettling. Why would such a healthy woman have died from something so unexplained, especially when there had been no immediate cause for alarm? As the day wore on, the guests found themselves in an increasingly tense situation. The events of the previous night, when the nursery rhyme had been played on the gramophone, had already set their nerves on edge. But now, with one of them dead, the sense of impending danger became impossible to ignore. The rhyme, which they had dismissed as a strange coincidence or a prank, now seemed to carry an ominous significance. They were no longer just strangers trapped on an island. They were players in a grim game, and the stakes had never been higher. With the day passing in silence, the guests became increasingly suspicious of one another. In hushed whispers, they began to speculate on the identity of the murderer. Could one of them have killed Mrs. Rogers? Was someone among them hiding a dark secret? Everyone knew that they were not alone on the island, but the isolation and the bizarre circumstances had started to make them question their own safety. Was this some sort of twisted game, or were they truly in danger? As evening approached, the remaining guests gathered again for dinner, though the mood was far from festive. Each person entered the dining room with an air of unease, casting furtive glances at their fellow guests, wondering if anyone else was as suspicious as they were. Mrs. Rogers' absence at dinner, although expected, seemed to emphasize the stark reality of what had just happened. The housekeeper's sudden death could not be ignored, and yet there was an overwhelming sense of uncertainty in the room. If Mrs. Rogers had been killed, who could have done it? And why? Thomas Rogers, still visibly shaken, was once again the one to serve the meal, his face betraying his anxiety. The guests ate in silence, the only sounds coming from the clinking of silverware against plates. No one dared to bring up the topic of Mrs. Rogers' death, though the unsaid words hung heavily in the air, each person aware that they were waiting for something, perhaps the next death, or perhaps some revelation that would finally make sense of their predicament. Just as the meal was winding down, a chilling interruption occurred. A loud noise rang out from the hallway, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. The guests froze, their hearts racing. Was it another of their number coming to join them for dinner? Or was it something or someone else? Thomas Rogers, though pale and trembling, excused himself to check on the disturbance. The guests were left to their own devices, their minds wandering back to the grim nursery rhyme. It was then that a strange feeling seemed to overtake the group. Each guest was keenly aware of the other's every movement, every word spoken. They couldn't help but wonder who among them would be next. The island's isolated nature had already played a part in the strange events. But now, as night fell and the storm clouds gathered on the horizon, the guests began to feel as though they were being driven to the brink of madness. The darkness outside seemed to press in on them, as if the island itself were closing in around them. When Thomas Rogers finally returned, he reported that the noise had been caused by a loose window that had blown open in the wind. This explanation, while simple enough, did little to alleviate the sense of foreboding that had settled over the group. It felt as though the island itself had become a malevolent presence, its very atmosphere pressing down on the guests, forcing them into a state of heightened paranoia. The idea that someone could be murdering them one by one seemed more and more plausible. Later that evening, as they gathered to discuss the events of the day, the guests took stock of what they knew. Mrs. Rogers was dead. There had been no obvious cause of death, but there was no denying that her death had been both sudden and inexplicable. The nursery rhyme had been eerily accurate in its prediction. One soldier had choked, and now only 9 remained. But was it a coincidence? Was someone deliberately picking them off one by one in accordance with the rhyme? Or was there another explanation that none of them could fathom? Suspicion ran high, and the guests began to turn on one another. Paranoia set in as they realized that they had no way of knowing who to trust. Everyone had something to hide, some skeleton in their closet. And as they pondered the events that had led them to this island, they began to wonder if they themselves might be implicated in a greater mystery. Who was behind the deaths? Was someone in the group a murderer, or was there another force at work on the island, something more sinister and far-reaching? Despite the growing tension, the guests knew one thing for certain: they were no longer safe. They had been drawn to the island under mysterious circumstances, and now they were caught in the grip of an unknown killer. The island had become a place of fear, of suspicion, and of death, and there was no escaping its cold, unrelenting grip. As the night wore on, they could only wait for the next move in the deadly game that had been set in motion. The following morning, the atmosphere in the house was thick with unease. The death of Mrs. Rogers had already set a chilling tone, and the mystery surrounding her sudden collapse lingered in the minds of the remaining guests. Now, as they gathered for breakfast, the grim silence was broken only by the sounds of plates being set down and the occasional cough or murmur. No one dared to speak about the elephant in the room. That one of them had died overnight, and they were still trapped on this isolated island with no one outside to help them. Thomas Rogers, the butler, entered the dining room in his usual manner, but his face betrayed the anxiety that had clearly taken root since his wife's death. His eyes flicked nervously from one guest to another, as though searching for something, an answer, a sign, a glimmer of hope. He seemed more a servant than ever, doing his best to carry out his duties, while silently grappling with the terror that gripped him. His once proud composure had been shattered, and he was now just another player in a deadly game he couldn't understand. Breakfast was sparse, each guest picking at their food in silence, the weight of what had happened already draining the joy from even the most mundane of actions. It was clear that the tension was beginning to break through the thin veneer of civility that had held them all together in the first few hours after their arrival. But no one dared to bring up the subject of death directly, not yet. There were too many unspoken questions, too many fears, and too many hidden motives. After breakfast, the group decided to meet in the drawing room to discuss the events. They knew they had to do something, though no one quite knew what that was. The most logical course of action seemed to be to investigate Mrs. Rogers' death, but that in itself was a dangerous proposition. How could they know that the rest of them were safe? The chilling nursery rhyme from the gramophone, which had seemed like nothing more than a macabre joke at first, now seemed to suggest that they were indeed being killed off, one by one, in the order it predicted. The guests assembled uneasily in the drawing room. In the face of an unexplainable tragedy, they found themselves searching for any scrap of information, any clue that might help them make sense of the situation. They looked to one another for answers, but there were no easy answers to be found. Each person had arrived on the island with their own secrets, their own motives, and their own fears. They had not come here by accident, but rather by design. Each had been invited under mysterious pretenses, each with their own reason for being chosen. And now, with the death of Mrs. Rogers, the realization dawned on them that they were all at risk. There was one thing that united them, the knowledge that there was no escape. The island, with its rocky shorelines and forbidding cliffs, felt like a prison, and they were its unwilling inmates. They had arrived under the illusion that this would be a brief and pleasant stay. But now it was clear that the island had become a tomb. As the group began to speak, the first words were tentative, hesitant. Who could they trust? What did they really know about one another? The guests began to exchange their theories about Mrs. Rogers' death, each one offering a different explanation. Some suggested that she had died of natural causes, perhaps a heart attack or an overwhelming sense of anxiety. Others believed that the death was part of a larger, more deliberate plot. It wasn't until Dr. Armstrong, the doctor in the group, spoke up that they began to seriously consider the possibility of foul play. Dr. Armstrong, who had been in the medical field for years, carefully examined the details of Mrs. Rogers' death. He confirmed that there were no obvious signs of injury, no physical trauma, but he also noted that there were subtle clues, symptoms of someone who had been poisoned. He pointed out the pallor of Mrs. Rogers' skin, the suddenness of her collapse, and the way her body had stiffened. It seemed to him that she had died from something that had acted quickly and decisively. Though he was no longer certain of what had happened, Dr. Armstrong's conclusion seemed to shift the conversation into a new direction. The group could no longer pretend that the death was an accident. Mrs. Rogers had been murdered, and they were all in danger. But who among them could be the killer? And more importantly, why? The conversation turned to speculation, and each guest began to examine the others more closely. The tension in the room was palpable as they exchanged wary glances, wondering if they were sharing the same fears. Could any of them be responsible for the death? Could one of them be plotting to kill again? It was an unnerving thought, but it was one that none of them could escape. As the day wore on, the group's paranoia grew. Each person seemed to grow more isolated from the others, retreating into their own thoughts and suspicions. No one wanted to admit it, but they were all beginning to look at one another with a sense of distrust. The tension grew to an almost unbearable level, and yet, no one knew what to do about it. In the midst of this mounting paranoia, the group began to turn on one another. At one point, General MacArthur, the retired military man, tried to calm the others with a dismissive remark. "We're all being ridiculous," he said. "There's no reason to believe anyone here is guilty. We've been brought together under strange circumstances, but that doesn't mean we should start pointing fingers." But his words did little to quell the rising sense of fear. In fact, his attempt to restore order only seemed to fuel the suspicions of the others. Was he trying to deflect attention from himself? Was he hiding something? The guests had already started to suspect that no one could be trusted, and General MacArthur's comment only added fuel to the fire. It was clear that the sense of unity that had initially existed among them had fractured beyond repair. As the day continued, the guests made one more attempt to discuss their situation rationally. They decided to revisit the nursery rhyme, studying its words once again. It was an odd thing to focus on, considering the danger they were in, but the rhyme seemed to hold the key to understanding their predicament. They noticed that the rhyme's verses were a cruel mirror of their own fates, each one eerily describing the manner in which they would die. In the back of their minds, they wondered if the rhyme was just a bizarre coincidence, or if it held a deeper, more sinister meaning. The fact that Mrs. Rogers had already died according to the rhyme's prediction only intensified the growing sense of terror. It wasn't just a nursery rhyme anymore. It had become a prophecy, a dark warning. One by one, they would fall, and they would have no control over their fates. What had started as a strange game was quickly turning into a nightmare from which there was no waking. By the end of the day, the guests were more convinced than ever that they were being hunted, each person marked for death in accordance with the rhyme. They had no way of knowing when the next murder would occur, or who would be the next victim. But one thing was certain: the island was a death trap, and the killer was among them. The atmosphere in the house was growing increasingly tense, suffocating with the weight of fear that seemed to permeate every corner. As evening descended upon the island, the guests were no longer pretending that everything was normal. The chilling reality of their situation had set in. They were stranded on this desolate island, surrounded by the unknown, and someone among them was a murderer. The death of Mrs. Rogers had been followed by a thick silence, and now the mood in the house was thick with suspicion. What had begun as a luxurious getaway had quickly turned into a grim and haunting ordeal. None of the guests dared to sleep easily, aware that they were at the mercy of a killer who could strike at any moment. Every shadow, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind seemed to carry with it the threat of death. Trust had been shattered, and they were all forced to confront the most terrifying question: who among them could be responsible for this horrific crime? The evening's events unfolded quietly at first, with the guests retreating to their respective rooms. The group had been divided, each person keeping their distance from the others, too afraid to engage in conversation. The once grandiose and social gathering had dissolved into a series of isolated individuals, each locked in their own fears. The common area of the house felt empty, cold, and impersonal, despite the rich decor. There were no conversations, no laughter, only the quiet ticking of the grandfather clock and the occasional rustle of footsteps on the marble floors. But then came the second death. By the time the night was fully settled, it had been confirmed. General MacArthur, the once proud war hero, was dead. His body was found in the study, a look of shock still frozen on his face. He had been struck in the head, seemingly by some kind of blunt instrument, and there were no signs of struggle. It was almost as if he had known he was about to die, that he had accepted his fate. His death was yet another grim confirmation of the rhyme's prophecy, each verse claiming its victim in turn. The guests had been waiting for the next murder, but the reality of it hitting so close to home was still enough to send shivers down their spines. General MacArthur had been one of the stronger personalities in the group, his military background giving him an air of authority. He had even attempted to dismiss the terror that had begun to grip the others, trying to hold the group together. But now, his death confirmed what they had all feared. No one was safe. No one could be trusted. The remaining guests gathered in the drawing room, once again seeking answers. The dim light from the fireplace flickered as they assembled, casting long shadows across their faces. They were more somber than ever, their previous suspicions having turned into desperate, frantic accusations. Everyone seemed to be questioning everyone else. Who could have killed General MacArthur? Was it one of them? Could it be the very people who had claimed to be his friends? In the wake of this second murder, the group began to divide even further. The initial sense of unity, born out of shared terror, had evaporated. They were all now looking over their shoulders, each one wondering if the murderer was among them, or if the killer was hiding in plain sight. The sense of security they had once taken for granted, even in the face of the strange circumstances surrounding their arrival on the island, had evaporated. There was little discussion, but the accusations and suspicions flew faster than the words. Mr. Bloor, the former police officer, stood with a furrowed brow, deep in thought. He had been examining the scene of General MacArthur's death, trying to make sense of it. Dr. Armstrong, ever the medical professional, had quickly verified that General MacArthur's death was caused by blunt force trauma, likely from a heavy object, though no such object had been found. But despite their best efforts, neither of them could make any sense of the crime. There were too many unanswered questions, too many variables. The killer was elusive, slipping through their grasp every time they tried to pin down the facts. As the discussion progressed, the focus turned once again to the nursery rhyme. It was an unnerving thing to keep returning to, but each murder seemed to follow its predictions in a disturbing way. General MacArthur had been the third to die, just as the rhyme foretold. It was no longer a coincidence. The rhyme had become a cruel guide, dictating the order of the murders in a way that felt almost supernatural. And as much as they tried to distance themselves from this uncomfortable fact, they could not escape the sense of inevitability that seemed to hang in the air. It was now impossible to ignore the horror of their situation. The killer wasn't an outsider. It wasn't some outside force they could run from or hide from. The murderer was one of them, walking among them, watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The once comforting walls of the island villa now seemed like the coldest of prisons. The guests had become rats in a maze, trapped with no way out. As the group continued to discuss the circumstances of General MacArthur's death, tensions reached a boiling point. Each person began to argue more loudly, their nerves fraying, their fear manifesting in sharp words and bitter glares. They were all feeling the weight of the situation, and no one could deny the truth any longer. They were slowly being picked off, one by one. The killer was methodical, precise. They were orchestrating the deaths like a sick, twisted puzzle, and they were watching every move the remaining guests made. Though no one had yet come to a definitive conclusion about who the killer was, the sense of unity was shattered beyond repair. They were all under suspicion now. No one could be trusted. And with each new death, the group grew more fragmented, more paranoid. The once innocent questions they had asked each other now seemed laced with doubt. Every word spoken, every gesture made was scrutinized, and no one was above suspicion. In the hours following General MacArthur's death, the atmosphere in the house became unbearable. Sleep was impossible for anyone who tried, each person tossing and turning, haunted by the specter of death that loomed over them all. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were all being watched, that they were being led down a path with no escape. The killer was still among them, and none of them knew who it was. With the loss of 2 lives, the realization finally hit home. None of them would leave the island alive if they didn't figure out who the murderer was. There was no help coming, no rescue on the horizon. They were alone, completely and utterly alone, and the only thing standing between them and certain death was their ability to outwit the killer. But as the hours dragged on, the chances of that seemed to slip further and further away. By the time the fifth death arrived, the once comfortable and serene island retreat had transformed into a graveyard of suspicion, fear, and isolation. The sense of dread that had pervaded the house since the first murder now loomed larger than ever. The remaining guests, already emotionally and psychologically shattered by the growing body count, had become consumed with the terrifying reality. They were being hunted, one by one, and the killer was one of them. The deaths, each more horrific than the last, were now inescapable. Mrs. Rogers' death had set the tone for the horror that followed, and with each new victim, the walls seemed to close in tighter. The murders were happening at an unnerving pace, with no explanation, no pattern that could be understood. General MacArthur had died under circumstances that left everyone perplexed, his murder seeming almost too easy, too inevitable. And now, it was Vera Claythorne who found herself at the center of suspicion. Vera, once a schoolteacher and the picture of composure, had been steadily losing her grip on reality. It was her mind that was unraveling now, twisted by paranoia and the creeping fear of death that gnawed at her every thought. With each passing hour, she began to question her own sanity. The atmosphere in the house had grown increasingly claustrophobic, as if the very walls were closing in on them, suffocating them with their own terror. She found herself retracing every step, every conversation, every seemingly innocent look, wondering whether each one had a hidden meaning, an underlying motive she had missed. Her thoughts were interrupted by a scream, and she felt a chill creep down her spine as she turned toward the source of the sound. It was Emily Brent, the pious and stoic elderly woman who had seemed impervious to the fear that had gripped the others. She was standing at the threshold of the drawing room, her face pale with horror, eyes wide in disbelief. The others gathered around, and what they found confirmed their worst fears. Another body lay in front of them, lifeless and still. It was Emily Brent, the woman who had once seemed so detached from the chaos. She had been poisoned, the cause of death immediate and clear. She had no chance of survival, and no one had seen it coming. Her death, cold and precise, was the latest twist in a string of murders that were seemingly impossible to prevent. In the moments that followed, the remaining guests were consumed by a frantic sense of urgency, their survival instincts kicking in. Each one had their own theory, their own accusation, but no one could figure out who the killer really was. The nursery rhyme hung in the air, a twisted reminder of the inevitable fate that awaited them all. It was as if the killer was deliberately playing a game, a sick game that had no rules, no mercy, and no hope of escape. Vera's thoughts turned to the rhyme again. Emily Brent's death, just as the rhyme foretold, seemed to come in perfect order. The rhyme had been playing out like a grisly script, one that couldn't be stopped. And as much as they tried to make sense of it all, it was becoming clear that there was no logic, no reasoning that could explain the chaos. The rhyme wasn't just a warning, it was a prediction, a prophecy that seemed to dictate the course of their deaths. The remaining guests began to look at each other with a mixture of fear, mistrust, and desperation. There was no safe place on the island anymore. There was no escape. They had been trapped in this nightmare together, and they were powerless to do anything about it. No one knew who would die next, and no one knew who would be left standing in the end. The very air around them seemed to throb with tension, thick with the weight of impending doom. Each individual had their own suspicions, of course. Mr. Bloor, the former detective, was quick to point fingers, but his attempts to investigate were thwarted by the sheer paranoia that infected the group. Dr. Armstrong, the physician who had been one of the more rational voices in the group, now seemed just as shaken as the rest. His calm demeanor, which had once been a source of comfort, had turned into an unsettling mask that hid his own growing fear. And then there was Lombard, the former soldier, who, though he seemed to have a better grasp of the situation, was equally as uncertain about who to trust. Everyone had their secrets, and no one was above suspicion. But it wasn't just the others who were becoming more and more paranoid. It was Vera herself. She had always been the most composed of the group, the one who had held onto some semblance of order amidst the chaos. But now, her mind was unraveling. Her past, her guilt over the death of Cyril, her involvement in Hugo's life, all of it was beginning to resurface in waves. She could no longer separate the things that had haunted her for years from the horrors that were happening around her now. Was she losing her grip on reality? Or was she simply becoming more aware of the true danger she was in? The lines between guilt and fear were starting to blur. As the guests convened once again, the ever-present threat of the killer loomed over them like a shadow they couldn't escape. The house was filled with murmurs of suspicion, accusations that only seemed to push them further apart. The more they tried to figure out who the killer was, the more the mystery deepened. Every theory, every lead, only seemed to unravel into confusion. The walls were closing in, and with each passing minute, it felt as though their chances of survival grew slimmer and slimmer. The clock ticked on, and still, no one was safe. No one knew who would die next, but they all knew it would happen. The rhyme had made that clear. And in the darkest corner of their minds, each person feared that the killer was already watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. As the sun set on the 6th evening on the island, the tension in the air was palpable, suffocating the group of remaining guests. It had now been days since the first death, and the pattern that had emerged from the mysterious murders seemed to have no end. What had initially appeared as an improbable series of coincidences had become an undeniable and horrifying reality. With every new death, the guests were not only losing members of their group, but also their last vestiges of hope and sanity. The atmosphere in the house had descended into a mixture of paranoia and hysteria. The deaths were no longer isolated incidents. They were now a horrifying progression, one that seemed to follow the rhythm of the nursery rhyme with disturbing precision. The deaths were no longer just tragic. They were a manifestation of an evil game that was being played out by some unseen hand. Each victim's demise was foretold by the rhyme, and the rhythmic certainty with which it played out left the remaining survivors shaken to their core. They could not deny it anymore. They were being hunted, but who was the hunter and who was the prey? By now, the survivors had retreated to their own corners of the house. The large, luxurious mansion, which had once seemed like a grand estate on a private island, now felt like a trap. The walls that once seemed to protect them now seemed to encroach upon them, pressing them closer together as they turned on one another. Accusations were growing louder. Every action, every look, every seemingly innocuous gesture was now being scrutinized for hidden meaning. The group was no longer functioning as a cohesive unit. They were slowly tearing themselves apart, pushed to the brink of madness by the psychological strain of the murders, the isolation, and the ever-present threat of death. Vera Claythorne, the schoolteacher turned suspect, was unraveling. The steady march of deaths was eroding the calm facade she had so carefully constructed in the early days. Her past, particularly her guilt over the death of Cyril, began to resurface in increasingly obsessive thoughts. She had been a devoted governess to Cyril, but her feelings for Hugo had led her to make decisions that she could never undo. The guilt of what she had done haunted her, and the memory of that tragic summer seemed to haunt her every step on the island. The pattern of the deaths seemed to be mocking her own past. She, too, had been an unwitting participant in a cruel game of fate, one where the stakes had been life and death. Vera was not the only one being eaten alive by her own thoughts. Dr. Armstrong, once the calm, rational physician who had worked to diagnose the mental states of others, was now consumed by his own fears. He, too, had come to the island with his own past weighing heavily on his shoulders. A doctor, no stranger to death and human suffering, had once been responsible for the death of a patient due to negligence. His professional reputation, already fragile due to his previous error, was crumbling under the strain of what was happening on the island. More than that, however, he was grappling with the terrifying realization that he could not save himself or anyone else. All his medical knowledge was useless here. No amount of medical expertise could solve the mystery of who the killer was, and his inability to take control of the situation was destroying him. Meanwhile, Lombard, the ex-soldier with a brash, self-assured demeanor, was beginning to show cracks in his own bravado. Though he had been one of the few who had maintained a certain level of practical intelligence amidst the chaos, even he was no longer immune to the creeping fear that pervaded the island. Lombard had been the one to suggest arming themselves with the revolver, though it had proven useless against the mysterious killer. The gun felt like nothing more than a fragile defense against an unstoppable force. Lombard had once been a man of action, but the situation had spun so far out of control that he was increasingly feeling out of his depth. The certainty of his survival was slowly turning into the cold fear of inevitability, just like everyone else on the island. And then there was Blore, the former detective. The one person who had initially seemed to have the sharpest mind for solving a mystery was now reduced to desperation. Blore had taken charge of organizing the group, constantly trying to form theories, to identify patterns, to put the pieces together. But with each passing death, his theories grew more desperate, more disconnected from reality. No amount of logic could explain what was happening. Blore began to lose faith in his own skills, unsure whether he had been the right man to lead the group out of danger. He, too, was beginning to question whether the killer was even a person at all. What if the deaths were not the work of a human at all, but some dark, supernatural force beyond their comprehension? The pattern of deaths continued to unfold with terrifying accuracy. The next victim, sadly, would be Dr. Armstrong himself. In the silence of the night, while the others rested uneasily, he had ventured out into the darkness, convinced that he could find some answer to the mystery. But no one saw him again. His body was discovered the next morning, pushed over the cliff. He had fallen to his death, and once again, the rhyme had proven accurate. The physician, who had tried to distance himself from the chaos and maintain a level of professionalism, had now become just another victim. And with each victim, the air grew thicker with fear and suspicion. Vera found herself alone in the parlor, staring at the walls, lost in her thoughts. She could hear the other guests moving about the house, whispering, accusing, plotting, and speculating. But there was a strange heaviness in her chest. The walls had become a mirror of her inner torment, and she could no longer tell where her guilt ended and her fear began. The sense of doom seemed to seep into every corner of the room, and she felt as though it was impossible to escape. With each passing day, she grew more and more convinced that she, too, would be the next to die. It was inevitable. She couldn't escape it. The rhyme was clear. 10 little soldiers went out to dine. One choked his little self, and then there were 9. The remaining 9 were now even more tightly wounded, their nerves stretched thin, their minds eroded by fear and uncertainty. The game had taken on a life of its own, and they knew that there was no one to trust, no way to save themselves from the madness and the killings that continued. Time was running out. The island that once seemed like a paradise now felt like a tomb, and it was only a matter of time before there was no one left to even question why it was happening. The rhythm of death had taken hold, and there was no escaping it. As the days passed, the remaining guests found themselves huddled together in various parts of the island's mansion, each of them desperately seeking a sense of safety and control that was slipping farther and farther away. The looming threat of death had become a living entity, casting its shadow over everything they did. Each new murder that had taken place left the group less cohesive, their will to survive weakening with every turn. The cruel rhythm of the nursery rhyme continued, and each victim had been claimed one by one with eerie precision. The tension was palpable. There was no one left to trust, and each guest knew that the next death could be their own. The island, once an isolated haven, had transformed into a fortress of fear. It was not the physical confines of the mansion or the surrounding sea that held them captive. It was the inescapable dread that had infected them all. The killer was still among them, and with each passing moment, the probability of survival diminished. The remaining group had now been reduced to just a handful of individuals, but the paranoia that had taken root in them made them seem like strangers to each other. The once familiar faces now appeared as potential threats, each person carrying with them an invisible mark of suspicion. Trust was a fragile thing, and with each new death, the walls between them grew higher. Vera Claythorne, whose fragile mental state had been fraying from the beginning, was now teetering on the edge of complete breakdown. The specter of Cyril's death, her own guilt, had been weighing on her heavily. In the isolation of the island, her thoughts had turned inward, plagued by self-loathing. Her connection to the rhyme had become undeniable. She had been the one to drown Cyril, whether by intent or accident, and now the island seemed to be punishing her for that past. The deaths that had occurred on the island now seemed like karmic retribution for the sins of the past. Sins she could never escape, no matter how far she ran. Vera found herself continually watching the other guests with a sharp, almost paranoid gaze, convinced that the killer might be closer than she realized. She was a woman constantly on the edge, unable to silence the voices in her head that whispered that it was only a matter of time before she, too, would fall. Her desire for survival was tangled with her guilt, and the lines between the two blurred more with each passing hour. Her once composed demeanor had given way to an almost desperate need to find an answer, to discover who among them was the murderer. But deep down, she also feared that the killer was not a person at all, but fate itself. Dr. Armstrong's death had left a void in the group, and with his fall to the rocks below, the once perceived order had crumbled further. Dr. Armstrong had been the one figure who had seemed to hold a modicum of rationality, an anchor in the swirling chaos. His medical expertise, though useless in the face of a killer they could not comprehend, had at least provided some semblance of hope. Now, with him gone, the sense of helplessness deepened. The group had no leader, no strategy, and no understanding of how to stop the killing. The next victim would be another blow to the already shattered group, General MacArthur, the former soldier who had been the first to truly show signs of resignation. He had given up long before the others, a man broken by the knowledge that he was responsible for the death of his wife's lover. The general had been a stoic figure, his secrets buried deep inside, but his guilt had weighed heavily on him. Now, the cruelty of the murders, the relentless ticking of the nursery rhyme, had taken its toll. No one was surprised when General MacArthur was found dead. He had simply sat down on the rocks by the edge of the island and waited. His death had been the most passive of all, the end of a man who had resigned himself to fate long before he had been claimed. Lombard, the soldier with a quick temper and even quicker wit, was the next person to begin cracking under the pressure. He had been one of the more proactive figures on the island, taking charge in a way that had seemed decisive in the early stages. His bravado, however, had begun to falter as the murderous tension tightened its grip. Lombard's response to fear had always been aggression. Yet as the body count mounted, he began to question his own actions. His previous insistence on carrying a weapon felt increasingly futile, and he couldn't shake the feeling that even the revolver had become a useless object, a symbol of his inability to control the situation. He began to distance himself from the others, his suspicions of his fellow guests growing. It was no longer about finding the killer, it was about surviving. But as much as Lombard believed he could outwit the others, he also knew that there was no escape. The murderer was one of them, and no matter how many steps ahead he thought he was still playing into the hands of an unseen force. In the stillness of the house, Vera, Lombard, and Bloor were the only ones left who had the courage to speak of the murders, albeit with varying degrees of sanity. Bloor's attempts to rationalize the situation seemed increasingly futile. The detective who had once been so confident in his logical approach was no longer so sure. His ideas grew more fantastical, and his theories drifted farther from reality. In the end, Bloor, like the others, realized that logic could not explain what was happening on the island. There was no rhyme or reason to the killings. They were happening according to a pattern they could not control, and each new death served as a grim reminder of their own inevitable fate. As the evening wore on, Vera found herself alone in her room, consumed by the weight of what had happened and what was yet to come. The sun had set, and the darkness outside mirrored the darkness in her heart. She stood by the window, staring out at the churning sea, a deep feeling of despair washing over her. The relentless march of time continued, and each passing minute felt like a betrayal. There was no escape. The island had become a prison, a place where the air itself seemed to thicken with death. She turned from the window, gazing at the empty rooms that had once been filled with conversation and laughter. Now, they stood silent, a stark reminder of the bloodshed that had come. Every corner of the mansion seemed to close in on her. She could no longer tell if she was alone or if the murderer was watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. Fear had become her constant companion, and with each breath, it seemed as if the walls of her sanctuary, however fragile, were closing in. In the distance, the sound of waves crashing against the rocks echoed in her ears, a constant, unrelenting reminder of the island's isolation and the cruelty of fate. With no one to trust and no way out, the group was doomed to face the same fate as those before them. It was not a matter of if, but when. As the days wore on, only 3 people remained on the island: Vera Claythorne, Philip Lombard, and William Blore. Their numbers had dwindled with each passing day, and with the increasing isolation, the remaining guests grew more desperate, consumed by their own fears. The grim nursery rhyme, etched in their minds like an inescapable mantra, echoed louder than ever. The end seemed inevitable, and every new day carried with it the crushing realization that no one would be spared. Vera, once a composed and rational woman, now found herself nearly overwhelmed by the terror that had taken hold of her mind. Each creak of the floorboards, each shadow in the corner of her vision, brought with it a surge of panic. The constant awareness that the murderer was among them left her eyes darting nervously from one face to the next. Her mind raced, frantically trying to make sense of the madness that surrounded her. Who could it be? Could it be Lombard, with his arrogant confidence and mysterious past? Or perhaps Blore, who had once been a detective and was now acting like a man grasping at straws? Her paranoia grew, yet there was a gnawing sense of guilt that clung to her, as if the past sins she had buried so deeply had resurfaced to claim her. She could no longer separate the feeling of fear from the guilt of Cyril's death, a drowning that had haunted her since the moment it occurred. She had thought she had put it behind her, but now, on this desolate island, the past seemed inescapable. Could it be that the murders were some kind of cosmic retribution for her role in Cyril's tragic end? Philip Lombard, too, felt the noose of dread tightening around his neck. A man of action, he had always relied on his quick thinking and his ability to navigate dangerous situations with ease. But this was different. Here, there was no enemy to confront directly, no immediate danger to fight off. The killer was one of them, and every time he looked around, he could see the suspicion and distrust in the other's eyes. Lombard had always been able to talk his way out of a tight spot, but now, it seemed like words were no longer enough. There was no escape from the island. The walls of the house, once a sanctuary, now seemed to close in on him, and the vast, unforgiving ocean was a reminder of their entrapment. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about understanding the rules of this twisted game they had been thrown into. But even Lombard, with all his bravado, didn't know who would be the next to fall. Blore, the ex-policeman, had become a mere shadow of the man he had once been. His mind, sharp and analytical when it came to solving puzzles, had become clouded with suspicion and doubt. Each step he took was heavy with the weight of uncertainty, and the more he tried to piece together the events on the island, the less sense they made. His once clear mind now swirled with confusion and fear. Who was the killer? Who could it be? The remaining guests had all seemed to have a motive: Vera, with her guilt over Cyril, Lombard, with his mysterious past, and Blore himself, who had buried secrets he had never shared with the others. There was no one left to trust. The three of them continued to orbit each other, their once brief conversations now laced with barely concealed animosity and mistrust. There was a palpable tension in the air, thick with the knowledge that any one of them could be the next victim. No one was safe. As the murders continued, the tension between the survivors grew, and every interaction, every word spoken, became a test of loyalty, or the lack thereof. The atmosphere on the island had become suffocating, and each of them could feel the weight of impending doom hanging over them like a sword ready to drop. By now, the murders had taken on an almost ritualistic quality, a pattern that had become too clear to ignore. It was as though the murderer was following the rhyme on the wall, carefully eliminating the guests one by one in the same order. It was chilling to think that whoever was behind the deaths had not only planned them, but had done so with a methodical, calculated precision. There was no room for mercy, no sense of hesitation. Each person's fate had already been sealed, and the finality of the deaths seemed to loom large over the remaining guests. The night had fallen, and the mansion was quiet, save for the wind outside and the occasional creak of the house. Vera, Lombard, and Blore had retreated to separate corners of the house, each of them consumed by their own thoughts. There was no conversation, no exchange of ideas. They were all too aware of the futility of words. The storm outside matched the turmoil inside, the island seemingly reflecting their inner chaos. With each passing hour, the isolation became more oppressive, and the oppressive weight of death seemed to press down on their chests. Vera sat alone in her room, the only light coming from a flickering candle that cast long shadows across the walls. She could hear the howling wind and the pounding of the waves against the rocks below, but all she could think about was what was happening on the island. The nightmare she had once thought was only a bad dream had become all too real. The murderer was here, in this very house, and there was nowhere to run. Her mind drifted back to the past, to the moment when she had made the decision that would haunt her forever. She could see Cyril, struggling in the water, her hand reaching out but never quite able to save him. Now, she could hear his voice in her head, taunting her, accusing her. It was as if he were a part of this twisted game, and she had been caught in the trap of her own guilt. Lombard, too, could feel the weight of the isolation pressing on him. He had always been able to bluff his way through dangerous situations, but this was different. There was no one to fool, no one to manipulate. The rules of survival on the island were simple. Trust no one, not even yourself. He wandered through the house, his eyes scanning the rooms for any sign of movement, any indication that someone was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. But all was still, and the silence was suffocating. Blore, on the other hand, had begun to crack under the pressure. His mind, once sharp and calculating, had become a whirlwind of suspicion and fear. He moved through the house with caution, his ears straining for the slightest sound, his senses heightened to the point of paranoia. Each creak of the floorboards, each flicker of light, set him on edge. He was convinced that the murderer was right behind him, watching, waiting. The trio's descent into madness had reached its peak. They could no longer trust each other, and the once clear lines between friend and foe had blurred into a fog of suspicion and dread. As the night dragged on, they all knew that the end was near. One of them would be the next to die, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Vera, Lombard and Blore were trapped in a nightmare of their own making. The island, which had once been an idyllic retreat, had become a prison, and the murderer's game was almost over. The cruel march of time continued, and the rhythm of the nursery rhyme remained, its final verse looming ever closer. The last remnants of hope had long since evaporated. Vera, Lombard, and Blore were no longer just survivors, desperately trying to outlast the killer. Now, they were merely waiting for the inevitable. Each had their own internal battle to fight, and each struggled against the suffocating grip of fear, guilt, and paranoia. Their collective desperation hung heavy in the air, pressing down on them as if the island itself were closing in. Vera had never been a woman to fall easily into despair. Yet now, every step she took seemed weighed down by the unrelenting burden of her past. She had killed Cyril, that much was undeniable. But what kind of killer was she? Was she like the others who had murdered out of malice or spite? Or was she simply a victim of her own self-delusion? The line between innocence and guilt had blurred long ago. Now, as the last three remained, she found herself questioning her very sanity. How could she have been so blind to the fact that she, too, had blood on her hands? The deaths around her seemed to echo back the dark recesses of her own soul. It wasn't just the murders on the island. It was everything, the guilt that had been buried for so long. The sins that were now impossible to deny. Her thoughts were constantly interrupted by the unnerving silence that had become the defining characteristic of their existence. There were no more sounds of the sea crashing against the cliffs, no more wind howling through the windows. It was as though the island itself had fallen into a stifling hush, waiting for something final to unfold. The oppressive stillness was broken only by the occasional distant creak of the floorboards, a reminder that they were never truly alone, not even in their most private moments. Lombard, ever the man of action, had been reduced to a shadow of his former self. His cocky confidence had dissipated entirely, leaving only a man struggling to hold onto whatever semblance of control he could. It was ironic, in a way. His entire life had been spent on the fringes of danger, taking risks that would send most people running. But here, trapped on this island with no means of escape, he was powerless. The very traits that had made him a survivor in the past now felt like the seeds of his undoing. In moments of quiet, he could feel the walls of the house closing in on him, the heavy, suffocating air of inevitability pressing down on his chest. He had no idea who the killer was, and even less idea of how to protect himself. He had survived so many situations in his life, but this felt different, unpredictable, unstoppable. Blore, too, had begun to unravel. His once keen mind, so sharp and analytical, had turned inward, spiraling into paranoia. Every shadow seemed like a threat, every flicker of light a harbinger of death. His hands, once steady and sure, now trembled as he clutched the revolver he had taken from Lombard earlier. It was the only thing that made him feel like he had any control over the situation. But even that felt like a false sense of security. He had been a detective, yes, but what use was logic when the very laws of reality seemed to break down around him? He couldn't think straight anymore. His thoughts were a mess of guilt and fear, and every movement of the others seemed to confirm his suspicions. Could one of them be the killer? Or could it be him, the one who had once solved crimes, now condemned by the very nature of his past? In the dead of night, when the house was completely still, the tension reached its peak. The remaining 3 survivors sat in their rooms, their minds racing as they tried to anticipate the next move. It had been days since the last death, but none of them could afford to relax. They knew the next victim could be anyone. In the silence of their own minds, they could hear the nursery rhyme playing over and over, a grim reminder of the order in which they would fall. 10 little soldiers, it sang, each verse counting down to the final moment. It was almost as though the island itself was mocking them, playing with their sanity until it had broken them entirely. Vera could hardly stand to be alone in her room. Every minute felt like an eternity. The moonlight filtered through the window, casting a pale glow over the floor, and for a moment, it seemed as if time itself had slowed. She knew she was waiting for something, the end, perhaps. But what form would it take? Would the murderers strike in the night, or would they make their move in daylight? What would the last moments on this island be like? She shuddered at the thought. Meanwhile, Lombard had started to come to a chilling realization. He could no longer deny the truth. There was no escape. There would be no rescue. The police weren't coming. No ship would sail in to take them away. They were trapped, left to play out a macabre game devised by an unseen hand. The realization was a crushing blow. He had relied on his wit, his strength, and his ability to manipulate those around him. But now, those skills felt irrelevant. None of them mattered. The only thing that mattered was survival, and even that seemed like an impossible goal. Blore, for his part, had become more erratic. The lines between reality and his twisted thoughts were beginning to blur. He began to suspect the other two more than ever. The paranoia gripped him with such intensity that he could no longer trust his own senses. Each breath he took felt like a struggle, his heartbeat echoing in his ears. The gun in his hands, once a symbol of power, now seemed like a lifeline and a burden. Who could he trust? Who could he turn to? He had once been the one to investigate crimes, but now he was trapped in an unsolvable riddle with only one possible solution. Vera, Lombard, and Blore were locked in their own private hells, each tortured by their past actions and the grim reality that death was all around them. Each felt the weight of their own guilt, their own role in the deaths that had already occurred, and yet none of them could bring themselves to point the finger at one another. They were all too consumed by their own fear to face the truth. The next morning came, but the island seemed no less bleak. The sense of doom that had been steadily growing finally reached its crescendo. There was no more room for doubt. The killer was one of them, and soon they would know who it was. It was just a matter of time. The night had grown impossibly dark, and the island seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. The last remnants of light were slowly swallowed by the heavy fog that hung over the mansion like a shroud, casting everything in a dreamlike, ominous glow. The final chapter of this horrific tale was unfolding, and none of the remaining survivors knew how long they could hold on to the fragile thread of hope that kept them clinging to life. With every passing moment, they knew they were one step closer to the inevitable. Vera, Lombard, and Blore were all but broken by their experiences. Each one had descended into a pit of madness, their minds frayed and shattered under the weight of fear, guilt, and the crushing knowledge that the murderer was among them. Trust had become a foreign concept. There was no more pretending. There was no more denial. Their every move was now guided by raw survival instincts, and they were willing to sacrifice anything, anyone, to stay alive for just one more day. Vera, with her guilty conscience weighing heavily on her, began to unravel further. She had always prided herself on being composed, on holding on to her dignity in the face of adversity. But now, she was far from the poised woman who had arrived on the island. Her thoughts were in constant turmoil, her mind twisting the events of the past into an incoherent frenzy. She had killed Cyril, yes, but was she any different from the others? Was she guilty of something far worse than what she had imagined? And what of the others on the island? Did they see her for what she truly was, a murderer? The more she questioned herself, the less she felt like the person she once was. The lines between reality and her twisted thoughts blurred, and the shadows that crept through the house seemed to mock her every step. Meanwhile, Lombard was locked in his own private struggle. His usual bravado had long since faded, leaving a hollow, defeated shell of the man who had once believed he could survive anything. The island had stripped away all the layers of deception he had built around himself. In his heart, he knew the truth. There was no way out. His physical strength, his experience, his cunning, all the things that had once made him a survivor, were no match for the terror and chaos that now reigned. The island had become an unforgiving prison, a place where no one could escape the inevitable. No matter what he did, no matter how hard he fought, he could not outrun the shadow of death that loomed over him. Blore, too, was descending into madness. The man who had once been so analytical, so methodical in his approach to everything, was now consumed by paranoia. He couldn't trust his own senses anymore. Every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind against the window, seemed like a threat, a signal that the killer was drawing closer. The gun that he had once relied on as a tool of security had become an extension of his own fear. It was no longer just a weapon, it was a lifeline. But he knew deep down that it wouldn't save him. The more he thought about it, the more absurd it all seemed. How had it come to this? How had they ended up here, on this isolated island? Each of them reduced to this hollow shell of a person, each of them haunted by their own past. And then, as the dawn began to break, the final revelation came. There had been no murderer, no unseen hand working from the shadows. The true killer had always been there among them all along. The island had played its part in manipulating their fear, their guilt, and their insanity. But it was the human mind, the darkness within, that had brought them to this point. In the quiet of the early morning, when all was still, Vera, Lombard, and Blore came to the grim realization that their fates had already been sealed. The killings had been orchestrated by a single mastermind, the very person they had least suspected, the judge. Justice Wargrave, with his unrelenting sense of morality and righteousness, had devised the entire plot as a twisted form of retribution for what he saw as the failings of society, the unpunished crimes of those who had escaped justice. Each death, each murder on the island had been carefully planned and executed to bring about a final reckoning. The game was rigged from the start. The revelation struck them like a blow to the chest. They had all been pawns in his sickening game. Wargrave had manipulated them, played on their guilt, and used their own fears to force them into a corner. His final act, the one that would ensure his own death, was as calculated as everything else. He had staged his own murder, faking his death to throw the others off the trail, to give them a false sense of hope. But it was all part of his plan, a plan that had reached its terrifying conclusion. Vera was the last to succumb. Her mind, already shattered by guilt and paranoia, could take no more. In a final, desperate act, she killed herself. The weight of her actions, the crushing realization that she had been complicit in her own demise, was more than she could bear. As her body was found, lifeless on the floor, it marked the final moment of the twisted game. And so the island fell silent. The last of the survivors, the final players in Wargrave's deadly scheme, were gone. The once proud mansion stood as a haunting reminder of the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. The nursery rhyme, with its cruel and mocking rhythm, now lay dormant, its tale of death finished at last. The legacy of "And Then There Were None" is one of darkness and despair. It is a story that explores the fragility of the human mind, the consequences of guilt, and the terrifying power of fear. Agatha Christie's brilliant manipulation of suspense and psychological tension kept readers on edge until the very end, leaving them with a chilling sense of finality. The themes of justice, retribution, and the inevitable march of fate are woven throughout the story, creating a narrative that lingers long after the final page is turned. The novel remains one of Christie's most enduring works, a masterful exercise in suspense and psychological horror. Its impact is felt in countless adaptations, reimaginings, and inspirations, proving that its core themes resonate with readers even decades after its first publication. And as the island and its dark secrets fade into history, the memory of the 10 victims remains, forever locked in the mind of those who dare to explore the twisted and unforgettable world that Christie created. And Then There Were None concludes with an unsettling silence, a void that leaves its readers reflecting on the darker aspects of human nature. Agatha Christie masterfully weaves a tale of suspense, guilt, and retribution that explores the boundaries of justice and morality. As the final revelations unfold, the true horror of the novel becomes clear. It is not just the brutal deaths or the ever-diminishing number of survivors that makes this story so terrifying. It is the realization that the killers are often not the monsters, but the people themselves, shaped by their past actions, by guilt, and by the depths of their own psyche. The novel's central theme is the question of guilt and justice. Each of the characters has been accused, rightly or wrongly, of a crime that they have escaped justice for in the past. Christie forces the reader to confront the moral complexities of these accusations. Are they deserving of death? Who is truly culpable for the tragedies they have been involved in? And who gets to decide who is punished? The fact that none of the characters are entirely innocent, yet none are fully guilty either, sets up a morally ambiguous landscape where the line between right and wrong becomes more and more blurred. Justice itself is put on trial throughout the book, as it becomes clear that it is not the law, but the people themselves who are responsible for meting out punishment. Wargrave's role as the orchestrator of the murders reflects his distorted sense of justice. His sense of morality, twisted by his own beliefs about fairness and righteousness, becomes the engine that drives the entire plot. His desire to right the wrongs of the world through murder, to serve as both judge and executioner, reveals the danger of a single person having the power to impose their own vision of justice without any regard for due process. His actions beg the question, can justice ever be truly impartial? Or is it always a product of personal biases, beliefs, and perspectives? Christie's narrative also explores the fragility of the human mind. As the characters' paranoia mounts and their isolation on the island intensifies, their psychological unraveling becomes almost as prominent as the physical deaths they experience. The fear, guilt, and the overwhelming sense of being trapped by both the island and their own histories send each character into a spiral of madness. closer they get to the truth, the more they lose themselves, consumed by the very emotions that brought them to the island in the first place. Vera's descent into madness, Lombard's shifting loyalties, and Bloor's obsessive need for control are all reflections of the human struggle to maintain sanity in the face of overwhelming fear. The psychological elements are a driving force in making. And then, There Were None not just a murder mystery, but a study of human nature under extreme stress. In the absence of traditional comforts, societal rules, and any semblance of safety, the darkest parts of the characters' personalities come to the forefront. Christie taps into this primal fear of being alone, of being judged, and of being punished without explanation. The island becomes a microcosm of society's failings, a place where the true nature of the characters is laid bare, free from the constraints of everyday life. The novel's final moments, with its chillingly bleak conclusion, also bring attention to the themes of fate and inevitability. Throughout the story, it becomes clear that none of the characters can escape their fate. The island, which might have initially seemed like a haven, becomes a cage, one from which there is no escape. In the end, no one is left to stand trial or answer for their actions. Death comes for everyone, regardless of their crimes, and it does so with a certainty that cannot be avoided. This tragic end leaves readers with a profound sense of futility, as the inevitability of death overshadows any attempts at justice or redemption. And then, There Were None remains one of Agatha Christie's most famous and most haunting works, a novel that transcends the traditional mystery genre and delves deeply into the complexities of human nature, justice, and morality. Its clever structure, its intricate plotting, and its exploration of psychological horror have made it a timeless classic. Though many of its characters are flawed and imperfect, they are undeniably human, and their fates serve as a reminder of the consequences of unchecked guilt and the dangers of moral absolutism. The novel's impact continues to reverberate in popular culture, inspiring countless adaptations and interpretations. It challenges readers to examine their own moral compass, their beliefs about guilt and punishment, and their understanding of justice in a world that often seems unfair. It reminds us that, in the end, there is no escape from the consequences of our actions, and that, like the characters in Christie's chilling narrative, we are all vulnerable to the twists of fate and the judgment of others. Agatha Christie's masterpiece is a timeless exploration of the human condition, and its themes, justice, guilt, fate, and the human psyche, remain as relevant today as they were when the book was first published. In the end, And Then There Were None leaves its readers not with answers, but with unsettling questions. And that uncertainty is what makes the novel so haunting, so memorable, and so impactful.